When Deborah Tate, sister of murdered actress Sharon Tate, walked onto the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood set and found Leonardo DiCaprio deep in conversation with Patricia Krenwinkel, one of her sister's actual killers, she collapsed in hysterics that stopped production for 3 days. Leo's method acting had led him to secretly visit Charles Manson in prison and establish correspondence with surviving family members, crossing a line that horrified everyone involved and nearly caused Quentin Tarantino to shut down the entire production. Before we dive into this disturbing true crime story, don't forget to comment where you're listening to this from. Now, let's get into the story. April 18, 2018, Spahn Ranch Recreation, Santa Clarita, California. Leonardo DiCaprio stood in the exact spot where Charles Manson's family had lived 50 years earlier, but he wasn't just visiting as Rick Dalton, his fading Western actor character. Over the past 6 months, Leo had been secretly conducting what he called deep immersion research into the Manson murders, including unauthorized contact with surviving family members and multiple visits to the 80-year-old Charles Manson before his death in November 2017. What Quentin Tarantino and the cast didn't know was that Leo's obsession with authenticity had led him into genuinely dangerous territory. The trouble began when Leo, unsatisfied with traditional research methods, reached out to Dr. Vincent Bugliosi Jr., son of the prosecutor who had convicted Manson, requesting access to sealed case files and evidence. When Dr. Bugliosi refused, citing the ongoing trauma to victims' families, Leo went around him, using his celebrity status to gain access to Corcoran State Prison, where Manson was serving his life sentence. Prison records, later obtained through court orders, show that Leo visited Manson 7 times between June and October 2017, ostensibly researching the psychology of cult leadership for his role. But Leo's interest went far beyond his character's needs. Rick Dalton was supposed to be a washed-up actor living next door to Sharon Tate. He had no connection to the Manson family in Tarantino's script. Leo's research was driven by his own fascination with what he described in his private journals as the intersection of Hollywood dreams and American nightmare. His journals, subpoenaed during a later lawsuit, contained disturbing entries about his conversations with Manson. Charlie understands something about the illusion of Hollywood that even I don't fully grasp. He saw through the fantasy and decided to destroy it. The situation escalated when Leo began corresponding with Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten, 3 of the women who had participated in the Tate LaBianca murders and were still serving life sentences. Using his connections in the entertainment industry, Leo arranged for these women to serve as consultants on the film, paying them substantial sums through a third-party intermediary. His justification, according to production documents, was that their insight would help him understand the mindset of 1960s Hollywood and the cultural forces that led to the murders. Margot Robbie, cast as Sharon Tate, was initially unaware of Leo's controversial research methods. She had spent months preparing for the role by working closely with Sharon's sister, Deborah Tate, studying home movies and trying to honor the memory of the murdered actress with sensitivity and respect. When Deborah mentioned that someone had been asking detailed questions about Sharon's final days and had somehow obtained access to crime scene photos that were supposed to be sealed, Margot became concerned about potential exploitation of the tragedy. The first sign that Leo had crossed ethical boundaries came during filming of a scene where Rick Dalton meets his neighbors, the Polanski family. Leo began improvising dialogue that wasn't in the script, making specific references to Sharon Tate's daily routines, her relationship with Roman Polanski, and details about the night of the murders that could only have come from law enforcement files or direct contact with the perpetrators. Quentin Tarantino called cut after Leo made a comment about Sharon's last meal that was so specific and disturbing that Margot Robbie broke character and demanded to know where Leo had obtained such information. The confrontation between Deborah Tate and Leonardo DiCaprio on the recreated Cielo Drive set represents one of the most disturbing incidents in Hollywood history. Deborah had visited the production at Margot Robbie's invitation, hoping to ensure that her sister's memory was being treated with respect. Instead, she arrived to find Leo in what appeared to be a friendly conversation with Patricia Krenwinkel, who was visiting the set as a historical consultant. Deborah's screams when she recognized one of her sister's killers could be heard 3 blocks away from the soundstage. "You brought her here?" Deborah sobbed to Tarantino, pointing at Krenwinkel. "You brought my sister's murderer to the place where you're pretending to honor her memory?" But the situation was more complex than Tarantino had realized. Leo had arranged Krenwinkel's visit without informing the director, using his producer credit on the film to authorize what he described as essential research meetings with primary sources. The legal liability alone could have shut down the production permanently. Patricia Krenwinkel, now 70 years old and having served 49 years in prison, had been granted a special day release specifically to meet with Leo, whom she had come to regard as a confidant through their correspondence. Prison records show that Krenwinkel had written over 200 pages of letters to Leo, describing not just the murders, but her ongoing psychological relationship with the crimes and her memories of Sharon Tate's final moments. These letters, later obtained by the Los Angeles Times, contained details so graphic and disturbing that they were never published in full. The meeting between Leo and Krenwinkel, captured by security cameras on the set, showed Leo displaying what appeared to be genuine warmth and familiarity with one of the most notorious murderers in American history. They embraced like old friends, and their conversation, partially recorded by sound equipment that was still running, included Krenwinkel telling Leo details about the night of the murders that had never been revealed in court testimony. "Sharon begged for her baby's life," Krenwinkel could be heard saying, "but Leo, you have to understand the context of what we were trying to accomplish." Margot Robbie's reaction to learning about Leo's relationship with the killers was immediate and visceral. She locked herself in her trailer for 6 hours, refusing to come out or speak to anyone except her therapist, who had to be flown in from Los Angeles. When she finally emerged, Margot delivered an ultimatum to Tarantino. Either Leo's contact with the Manson family ended immediately, or she would quit the film and go public with the story. "I cannot and will not portray Sharon Tate in a film where her killers are being treated as valued consultants," she stated in a formal letter to the producers. The legal ramifications began immediately. Deborah Tate filed restraining orders against Leo, Krenwinkel, and the production company, seeking to prevent any further contact between the convicted murderers and the film. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office launched an investigation into how Krenwinkel had been granted permission to leave prison for what was essentially a social visit. The California Department of Corrections suspended 3 officials pending investigation into the unauthorized release. But the most disturbing revelation came when investigators examined Leo's communications with Charles Manson during the final months of the cult leader's life. Transcripts of their conversations, recorded by prison officials as part of standard security procedures, showed that Manson had been sharing previously unknown details about the murders and his philosophy with Leo, who was taking detailed notes. In their final conversation, just weeks before Manson's death, the cult leader told Leo something that would fundamentally change the direction of Tarantino's film. "You want to understand Hollywood? I'll tell you the real secret. It was never about the murders. It was about rewriting the story. That's what you movie people do, right? You rewrite history to make it more entertaining." The psychiatric evaluation of Leonardo DiCaprio, ordered by the film's insurance company after his contact with the Manson family was revealed, uncovered a disturbing pattern of what Dr. Elizabeth Morrison described as perpetrator identification syndrome. Leo had not just been researching the murders academically, he had developed what appeared to be genuine emotional connections with the killers and had begun adopting some of their psychological frameworks for understanding the crimes and their aftermath. Dr. Morrison's confidential report, leaked during subsequent litigation, revealed that Leo had told her, "People think the Manson murders were about random violence, but they were really about the destruction of Hollywood innocence." Charlie and his family understood something about the entertainment industry that we're still afraid to admit. They saw through the fantasy and decided to end it. When Dr. Morrison asked Leo if he believed the murders were justified, his response was chilling. "I think they were inevitable. Hollywood creates these perfect illusions, and someone was bound to shatter them eventually." The impact on the other cast members was devastating. Brad Pitt, who had initially enjoyed working with Leo on their shared scenes, became increasingly uncomfortable with his co-star's behavior and apparent sympathy for the murderers. During filming of the scene where Cliff Booth confronts the Manson family at Spahn Ranch, Pitt broke character and confronted Leo directly. "I don't know what's happened to you, man, But you're talking about these people like they were misunderstood artists instead of brutal killers. It's sick. Quentin Tarantino found himself facing an impossible situation. Leo's research had provided authentic details and psychological insights that were making the film more realistic and compelling than anything Tarantino had ever directed. But the methods Leo was using were so ethically questionable and legally problematic that they threatened to destroy not just the production, but Tarantino's reputation as a filmmaker. The director made a controversial decision. He would continue working with Leo, but would completely rewrite the film's ending to distance it from the actual historical events. The decision to have Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth kill the Manson family members instead of allowing them to murder Sharon Tate was not just a creative choice. It was Tarantino's attempt to psychologically separate his film from Leo's disturbing research into the actual crimes. I realized that Leo had gotten so deep into the real murders that the only way to save the film was to completely reject that reality, Tarantino later admitted. The fantasy ending wasn't just entertainment, it was a psychological necessity. But Leo's reaction to the script changes revealed how deeply his identification with the case had affected him. He objected strenuously to the fictional ending, arguing that it dishonored the historical truth and minimized the significance of what the family had accomplished. In a heated argument with Tarantino that was overheard by multiple crew members, Leo said, "You're turning this into a comic book when it should be a serious examination of American cultural violence. These people died for a reason, and that reason matters more than your fantasy about heroic actors." The psychological evaluation also revealed that Leo had been experiencing what Dr. Morrison classified as intrusive identification dreams, where he would dream about the murders from the perspective of both victims and perpetrators. These dreams had become so vivid and disturbing that Leo had begun taking prescription sleep medication to avoid them. But instead of seeking therapeutic help, he had been using the dreams as source material for his performance, incorporating details from his nightmares into his portrayal of Rick Dalton. The FBI investigation into Leonardo DiCaprio's contact with the Manson family was triggered when prison officials discovered that Krenwinkel had been receiving substantial payments through intermediaries connected to the actor. Federal agents suspected that Leo might be paying convicted murderers for information, which could constitute conspiracy, obstruction of justice, or interference with the federal prison system. Special Agent David Chen, who had worked on organized crime cases involving witness tampering, was assigned to investigate what the Bureau classified as potential criminal conspiracy involving entertainment industry figure and incarcerated felons. The federal investigation revealed the full extent of Leo's involvement with surviving family members. In addition to his correspondence with Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Van Houten, Leo had also been in contact with Charles Tex Watson, the family member who had actually committed most of the killings. Watson, serving a life sentence in Texas, had provided Leo with a detailed written account of the murders that included information never revealed in court testimony. Federal investigators were particularly concerned about payments totaling over $150,000 that Leo had made to various family members through shell companies. The investigation took a darker turn when agents discovered that Leo had also been in contact with Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm, the Manson follower who had attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford in 1975. Fromm, who had been released from federal prison in 2009, had been meeting regularly with Leo at his Malibu home, ostensibly to discuss the psychological dynamics of cult membership. Surveillance footage obtained through court orders showed Fromm visiting Leo's property multiple times, staying for hours-long meetings that federal agents found suspicious. The most disturbing discovery came when federal agents executed a search warrant on Leo's home office. They found thousands of pages of documents related to the Manson case, including crime scene photographs that were supposed to be sealed, personal items belonging to the victims that had somehow been obtained from evidence storage, and what appeared to be a shrine to Charles Manson featuring photographs, letters, and personal artifacts. FBI forensic specialists determined that some of the evidence in Leo's possession had been stolen from Los Angeles Police Department storage facilities. Deborah Tate's lawsuit against Leonardo DiCaprio, filed in Los Angeles Superior Court, alleged intentional infliction of emotional distress, violation of victims' rights, and exploitation of her sister's murder for commercial purposes. But the lawsuit revealed information that went far beyond civil damages. Deborah's attorneys had uncovered evidence that Leo had been planning to produce a documentary about the Manson murders, featuring exclusive interviews with surviving family members, essentially profiting from his relationships with her sister's killers. The production of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood nearly shut down completely when Warner Brothers' executives learned about the federal investigation and the potential legal liabilities. Studio head Kevin Tsujihara personally flew to Los Angeles to meet with Tarantino and evaluate whether the film could continue with Leo in the lead role. The meeting, according to industry insiders, was heated and resulted in Tarantino threatening to quit the project rather than replace his leading man. The resolution came through a complex legal agreement that remains partially sealed. Leo agreed to end all contact with Manson family members, surrender all evidence and documents in his possession to federal authorities, and submit to ongoing psychological evaluation. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed not to file criminal charges related to his contact with the convicted killers, but the agreement also included provisions that effectively ended Leo's ability to research future roles through direct contact with criminals or crime victims. The completed Once Upon a Time in Hollywood bears the psychological scars of Leonardo DiCaprio's disturbing journey into the Manson murders, but audiences watching the film have no idea of the real-world trauma that shaped its creation. Leo's performance as Rick Dalton was praised for its vulnerability and authenticity, but critics and viewers were unaware that the fear and paranoia they saw on screen came from Leo's genuine psychological damage from his contact with the killers, not from acting technique. The film's famous ending, where Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth brutally kill the Manson family members instead of allowing them to murder Sharon Tate, was Tarantino's attempt to psychologically rescue both his film and his leading man from the dark reality they had explored too deeply. "I had to give Leo a way to symbolically defeat the people who had gotten into his head," Tarantino later explained. "The violent fantasy ending wasn't just entertainment, it was therapy." Margot Robbie's portrayal of Sharon Tate became a tribute not just to the murdered actress, but to everyone who had been traumatized by Leo's exploitation of the tragedy. Robbie worked closely with Deborah Tate throughout the remaining production, ensuring that every scene honored Sharon's memory and rejected the nihilistic worldview that had infected Leo's approach to the material. "Margot saved the film from becoming something dark and exploitative," Deborah Tate later said. "She reminded us that Sharon was a person, not just a victim." The psychological impact on Leo was permanent. Dr. Morrison's final report, completed after the film's release, noted that Leo continued to exhibit signs of what she termed perpetrator trauma, psychological damage that typically affects law enforcement officers and journalists who work too closely with violent criminals. He experienced ongoing nightmares, periods of depression, and what Morrison described as moral confusion about the nature of violence and justice. Leonardo DiCaprio never spoke publicly about his contact with the Manson family or the federal investigation that followed. His subsequent film choices reflected a deliberate distancing from violent or controversial subject matter, focusing instead on environmental documentaries and historical dramas that kept him far from the psychological danger zones he had explored during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Industry insiders noted that he turned down multiple roles involving real-life criminals or victims of violence. The Manson protocols, quietly implemented by major studios after the investigation, require psychological evaluation and legal review for any actor seeking to contact real criminals, victims, or their families during film preparation. These protocols specifically cite the DiCaprio case as an example of how method acting can cross from professional technique into exploitation and psychological damage. Film schools now use Leo's experience as a cautionary tale about the ethical boundaries that actors must maintain when researching traumatic subject matter. Deborah Tate's lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but she used the settlement to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting crime victims' families from exploitation by the entertainment industry. "What Leo did to my family was a second murder," she said in her final statement about the case. "He took our trauma and used it for his own purposes, just like the killers took Sharon's life for theirs." The surviving Manson family members who had been in contact with Leo faced disciplinary action within the prison system. Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten lost visitation privileges and were transferred to higher security facilities. Charles Tex Watson was placed in solitary confinement for 6 months as punishment for his unauthorized correspondence with Leo. These consequences effectively ended any possibility of other actors or filmmakers gaining similar access to the convicted killers. Today, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is remembered as Quentin Tarantino's love letter to 1960s Hollywood and a fantasy about preventing historical tragedy. But for those who know the true story of its creation, the film serves as a reminder of how the pursuit of authenticity in art can become a form of violence against the very people it claims to honor. Leonardo DiCaprio's journey into the darkness of the Manson murders nearly destroyed him psychologically and definitely destroyed his ability to work as he once had, proving that some stories are too dangerous to tell and some truths are too dark to explore, even in the name of great art. This is the shocking true story of how Leonardo DiCaprio's method acting for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood led him into dangerous contact with the Manson family killers, federal investigation, and psychological trauma that changed him forever. Thank you for listening to this disturbing journey into Hollywood's darkest research methods. Don't forget to rate our story out of 10 in the comments and tell us which other Leonardo DiCaprio controversial story you'd like us to uncover next. Until next time, remember that some stories are too dangerous to research, and some truths are better left unexplored.